And it is going to be reporting to our cloud, so we'll have that good and taken care of.
Okay, good.
Okay, and I will make you the host now. Okay, so you should see the host controls and be able to open up the participants pane at the bottom, and you'll see a new pane to the right of your screen that lists everyone that's in the meeting.
Okay, I think I do.
Okay.
Should be okay. Participants. Okay, got it. Security, I don't need to do anything there.
No. But in the bottom of the participants pane on the right, you'll be able to see an option that allows you to unmute the speakers. So during public comment, you'll be able to unmute people so they can make a comment.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, so I think I'm all good.
Okay, great. And feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. I'm happy to help.
Okay, will do. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I hope you have a great night.
I know we will. All right.
All right.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Okay, I show that it is now 6 o'clock, and I'm gonna go ahead and call the meeting to order. I'm gonna be trying to manage the meeting and manage Zoom, so I will appreciate your feedback in case something is going wrong and I don't know about it. So for example, I'm gonna unmute Dorothy right now, and also Mike and Patricia. And did that work? So you said Dorothy, Patricia, and Mike. All
Hello,
right.
Joe. Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hi, Patricia.
Hello.
And Dorothy.
Hey,
All right.
Dorothy.
And so, with that said, so I'm going to call the meeting to order at 6:01. And I'm going to do the roll call here of Mike is here, Patricia here, Dorothy here. Everybody just said that, so we got that all recorded. So we have a quorum, and I don't believe that Rich is going to attend, so we're going to go ahead and move forward. And so at this point, we have item number 3, comments from citizens and members who have signed sign-up sheet to speak, a 3-minute limit per person. So at this point, I am going to unmute everybody. Or it says ask to unmute. So
I'm gonna mute.
I think I have, oh, it says mute all. Allow participants to unmute themselves, yes. So I've allowed all participants to unmute yourself. If anybody wants to make a comment, please unmute yourself and then give us a comment. Is there anybody trying to say anything?
I am. This is Patty Flunker.
Okay, there you are. Go ahead.
Well, I think I can speak for a lot of people that have been talking in the neighborhood. We've been seeing for the past 4 weeks, if not more, a lot of water trucks come into the community, go to the water plant. And there has been nothing put out to the customers of what's going on, whether water is being taken out or water is being put in. And I think it would be probably a good idea that Windermere put something out to let us know what's going on. Why are we having either water taken out or water being brought into our community?
Okay, anybody else have any comments? Any other comments from anyone? I've tried to unmute everybody. This is how I'm doing it, by the way. I think you can see my screen. And so let's see, I'm going to ask 262. Oh, my internet is unstable. 262-831 to ask to unmute. Grant, I don't know, I'll ask to unmute, but Grant's going to be later. Marcia Westerman asked to unmute if she wants to say anything. And then I'm going to go to Nye, asked to unmute. And then Patty just made comments. So any other comments from anybody? Not hearing anything, I am going to go ahead and mute all. Mute all current. Well, all right. And then I'm going to go ahead and unmute Dorothy and Mike and Patricia. And then y'all will just have to unmute yourselves. I think that's how it's working. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to item number 3, which is approval of board meeting minutes for September 22nd, 2020. Mike, you sent minutes out, and I saw that Dorothy had some good comments. And I don't know if there was any other comments from Patricia. Those comments and Dorothy's comments looked good to me.
I wasn't at the meeting, so I really don't think I can approve the minutes not being there.
Okay. Well, with that being said, I mean, I'll go ahead and move to approve the meeting minutes of the September 22nd, 2020 board meeting.
I'll second it.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. Thank you, Mike. Good work on that as usual.
So just to make sure I got it right. So Patricia, you recused yourself from that. So it's just Joe, Dorothy.
Right.
Yeah, I don't see that I can actually vote on the minutes since I wasn't in attendance at the meeting. I could be wrong, but
That's correct.
okay.
All right, so let's move to item number 4.
Five.
Five, sorry. 5, thank you. Adoption of election procedures for the annual members meeting. Board will consider and take possible action needed to begin adoption of election procedures for 2021 annual meeting. Dorothy, this is your item. I will ask you to lead us through.
Yeah, so the first thing that is on the election procedures is to establish the credentials committee. It's supposed to be 3 members of the members. Sorry, my brain's not working. Anyway, so Carrie Gibson has agreed to be on the credentials committee, and then myself and Patricia. And basically the credentials committee will review, I've gotten in the new template from Texas Rural Waters for the election procedures. And so I'll update from the previous year, whatever changes were made, and then have Patricia and Carrie go over that. And then the next thing, when it comes time, the credentials committee will present that to the board for their approval so that everything gets going in motion. And then the credentials committee's responsibility is that when the director applications come in, they just take a look at those and make sure that there's nothing missing. And, you know, if somebody forgot to fill in a portion of it, they can go back to them and say, did you mean to keep this blank, or did you want to fill this in, and just get that corrected. So anyway, I guess I'll make a motion to have the board appoint Carrie Gibson, Patricia, and myself for the credentials committee for the next upcoming election.
So I'll second that motion. So hearing that we have a motion to accept the credentials committee as laid out by Dorothy, do we have any further discussion at this time? Hearing none, we'll go ahead and call the vote. All in favor of adopting the credentials committee as laid out by Dorothy, which would consist of Dorothy, Patricia, and Carrie Gibson. We will go ahead and vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any
Just-
opposed? Motion
Just,
carries.
just to be clear, when there are board members that might be running again, that's why it was Patricia and I, because your positions, the other 3, are up for election if you so choose to run.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right, item number 6, real estate committee. Receive update regarding WOWSC property and airport area. Consider and take possible action on moving forward with the marketing of WOWSC property in airport area. So the real estate committee is comprised of Dorothy Taylor and Rich Schaefer. Rich isn't here today, so Dorothy, I'm hoping that you might have a report.
Well, Rich and I are working on just trying to get all the ducks in the order, consulting with legal as well as just, you know, getting all the stuff we need done. So I don't really have an update other than, you know, we've talked about some different options, reaching out to airport people to see if they have any recommendations. But we have another meeting this week. Rich and I are going to get together. And so I'm hoping that, you know, we'll have more of an update, but we're trying to just kind of make sure that we don't lead ourselves into a dark path of lawsuits. So we're trying to be careful about knowing what we can and can't do.
I think that's a very responsible perspective. Okay, so do we need to consider and take possible action on moving forward with the marketing of property, or should we just wait on that?
I think we should wait because I think that, you know, Rich and I need to do some more work on, you know, I mean, I see it as that, you know, we're going to make proposal to the board. And so I think we want to kind of have our ducks in a row before we come to the board. So I don't really know that there's anything that we need to vote on to do today, other than, I mean, you've already formed us as the committee. So I don't think we're prepared to take any action right now.
Okay. Well, with that said, you know, I need to go back and open item number 3 before we move on to the workshop with Grant. And item number 3, we had a member write in something, and let me find that real quick. Hold on just a second, because I completely forgot about that. It's hard to do 5 things at once with the with running the meeting and doing the Zoom stuff, so forgive me. So Mike, you received that note from Mr. Flunker regarding, it says, please make sure this is entered into the record for the 10/12/2020 meeting, and regarding agenda item number 6. Is that is that something that we can put in for to the minutes, or how do we handle that?
You want to read it in, and I'll copy it then.
Yeah, so I'll read it. Here is what it says. Regarding agenda item 6, real estate committee receive update regarding WOWSC property and airport area. Consider and take possible action on moving forward with the marketing of WOWSC property in the airport area. The property has been appraised, and we have been assured by Jose de la Fuente that Dana Martin gave back the 7 acres taxiway access. Now all you have to do is hire a real estate agent with 0 ties to Dana Martin, Bill Ernest et al., and sell it for top dollar, starting price $760,000. Here's the WOWSC appraisal from Bolton. Jose de la Fuente's law firm picked Bolton and said they were the best. And then there's a hyperlink, and it says there are many great sites that garner the highest and best price possible. In fact, Dana Martin lists Spicewood Airport property on Barnstormers for her clients. Teal Van Eman has a current listing. Glad I could have been of some service to y'all. Regards, www.barnstormers.com, and then some additional information there from Spicewood Hangar and Airport, or Sotheby's for, oh, I see, this is another listing. All right, so we've read that into the minutes for that that member. My apologies for forgetting that. It was just spurred when we went through item 6. So, all right, and I'm gonna go ahead and do one more thing. Hold on one more second, please. see what happens is, oh, here we go. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next item, which is number 7. Newgens Strategies will facilitate workshop for the board to aid in the establishment of written financial policies and develop a plan to transition into compliance with the adopted financial policies. As everybody might recall, we enjoyed receiving a report from Grant Rabon from Newgens Strategies a few weeks ago, analyzing our financial situation and health, and giving us a history, showing us some things about where we are in regards to several different measures of financial assessment. We at the last meeting asked to conduct a workshop with Newgens Strategies and Grant, and we did it specifically for the purpose of adopting or working to adopt some financial policies that Grant recommended that we consider. Now be on your screen, although there's always a little. So the real purpose, or the main purpose, I should say, that we tried to have this meeting is to talk about these different financial measures and how we could get there. We have some other things regarding the loan that are going to be happening here very soon. And by the way, thank you, Mike, for all of your help last week while I was gone in getting all those loan papers, worked up and what have you. And I believe we're going to be closing on that sometime this week. So we should be funded and have that money available to us. So that makes this exercise very, pertinent, timely, and important. So with that, I think I've probably done enough of a rambling there, and I've asked to unmute Grant. I don't know if you can see that, Grant, but oh, yep. There you are. Okay, so Grant, hopefully my setup there was appropriate.
Yeah, it was, Joe. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this body again. If for whatever reason while I'm talking, you're having a hard time hearing me or any kind of technical difficulties, please speak up and let me know, and we'll work to resolve those. I appreciate the time. I think the goal from my perspective is to talk through some of the policies that this board might consider for the utility, some financial policies to assist in managing the utility looking forward. And I think so I envision this being, if this is going to be the most productive, an open discussion and feedback on these various options that I'm going to kind of walk you through. If there happens to be, consensus around particular terms or policies, I'll make note of those. My understanding, we're not taking any action on any of these at this time. This is more of a discussion to try to discern what is the best path forward with regard to these policies. So I will be taking notes. If there's consensus around some, that's great. If there's need for further discussion or time to ruminate on them, that is okay as well. This should not be entered into lightly or rushed. So I'm very happy to facilitate the discussion, and we'll see how that works. I think to begin with, my suggestion is that there are a couple of areas that might be beneficial to have financial policies, written financial policies around, that are specifically required in the loan covenants for the proposed CoBank loan. Although there doesn't have to be a financial policy for those items, they still are requirements of the utility, given that they are in the debt covenants themselves. But I think I'd like to start there. And what makes the most sense to me is to start with the debt service coverage requirement. Your proposed CoBank loan requirement has a covenant that you will maintain debt service coverage of at least 1.25. And so what that means is, let me step back. That is how that is calculated is defined in the covenant itself. Many times there are slight nuances from one entity to another and how that's calculated. But in broad terms, it is to take the revenue of the utility, subtract out cash O&M expenses, and that residual, when divided by that year's debt service obligation, needs to be at least 1.25. So for every $1 in debt service you need to make in that year, you need to have available for debt service $1.25 to remain in compliance with the covenant.
Are you showing
Right.
something,
Go ahead.
Grant, are you showing something or just talking?
No, I'm just discussing this. Sorry, Mike. Thanks for asking that question. I'm just discussing it.
Okay. So could you go through that calculation again?
Sure.
Revenue minus.
Yeah, take the revenue, subtract out cash O&M expenses, and I say cash specifically because you don't subtract out depreciation, as it's not or amortization, as they're not cash expenses. And that residual left over is referred to sometimes as available to pay debt service. And that needs to be for every $1 of debt service you need to make in that year, you should have at least $1.25 of available to pay debt service to remain in compliance with that covenant in the proposed CoBank loan. And that 1.25 is a common requirement.
Okay, so O&M is operations and management, or what?
And maintenance. I apologize. Thank you for when I use a shortcut or a nomenclature there that I'm not making myself clear. Please, by all means, stop me for clarification. Yeah, operations and maintenance expenses. So specifically, what is not included in there is capital reinvestment. Those capital dollars are not part of that O&M expense.
And Grant, I put up, I don't know if you can see the screen I'm sharing, but I put up our last month's summary or August summary. We haven't gotten the September report yet. And it shows a debt to service coverage ratio of 1.15. Now, I don't know how it was calculated, if it was calculated, in the manner that you suggested, or you said that our bond covenants are. I mean, I suspect it's close in terms of how they did it, but I just, thought I would pull that up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that is very similar to the debt service coverage calculation for the year of 2019 that I calculated in the report that I presented last time I spoke to this body. So that seems to be tracking with recent history. That 1.15 you have that you're showing there may be for not the full year, for several months, or maybe it's just 1 month. So that can bounce around quite a bit. Potentially, if you have, summer revenues are high or expenses are high, that number can move around a little bit month to month.
So Do you mind if I look through the report and find
Yeah,
out?
scroll up to a table a little bit further up. I don't remember what number it is. Keep scrolling till you see. Keep going. There you go. Debt service coverage. My calculation for coverage for all of 2019 was that you were down at 1.11 times debt service coverage.
Okay.
So it is also true, I guess, it is not particularly helpful for the utility to target as part of their financial policy the 1.25 times that is in their covenant itself. Because doing so implies that if you, for example, budgeted under the presumption and targeted achieving a 1.25 debt service coverage, it would mean that any unexpected expenses or shortfalls in revenue due to weather or any other reason could put you into technical default on that covenant, because you might drop just below 1.25. And so it is generally best practice to set your target, your financial policy that you would be using as a means to, for budgeting and other purposes, to pick something greater than 1.25 or whatever your covenant requirement may be, to ensure that you're not just on the razor's edge of being in technical default, due to normal variations in revenues or expenses. So what you see on your screen is, again, these were possible financial policies, and they are not written in stone, and the way they're written can be adopted and changed around for whatever makes the most sense for the utility. But what was shown here as a possible debt service coverage policy is planning for or targeting at least 1.5 times debt service coverage. It need not be that exact number. This was just an example, but I think this would be a good opportunity to hear from you guys some feedback or questions you might have on what might be the appropriate coverage to target if this is going to be something that you guys formally adopt as a financial policy.
So one of my questions has to do with everything that gets subtracted out of revenue. So you said operations and maintenance. What about legal?
Yes, that would be a cost that would typically be subtracted as part of the process of developing the funds available to pay debt service. The idea is what is actually available to make this debt service payment, and in any one year you might be able to forego capital spending. Obviously that's not a good long-term plan, but in a pinch, if the utility had to forego capital spending in a year, assuming there was no emergency or anything like that, the thinking is, well, you would pay debt service before you would make those capital reinvestments, and therefore these funds are available to pay debt service. Paying your legal bills, just like your electric bill or the chemical bill, or paying your operator, all those costs are going to have to get paid, just to operate the utility. And so the idea is take those out first, and what's left over is kind of not discretionary, but it is more in alignment with what realistically could be used by the utility to make this debt service payment.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, great questions, Mike. So I guess I'm interested in hearing from anyone on the board if they have questions or thoughts on what might be an appropriate target, if any, for your financial policies.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dorothy.
Grant, you were saying that if a loan requires the 1.25, now why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we pick that as the amount?
Yeah, good point. And what you could write in the financial policy is that the debt service coverage shall never fall below 1.25, consistent with what you've already committed to in your bond covenants. But that doesn't really do much. You're already obligated to do that. The idea of the financial policy is to give the utility something to aim for in order to give them some cushion or room for error, acknowledging that unexpected things happen. Revenues sometimes don't materialize the way they were budgeted or planned. Expenses sometimes come up that are unanticipated. And so what's the level that would be helpful for the utility to target for debt service coverage when planning and budgeting that would give them comfort that they would, even under normal variations in outcomes, they would still be in compliance with the hard and fast requirement stated in the covenant.
Okay, so this is something as a goal that should be above and beyond the requirement by the loan.
Right, and the idea, and you're asking, I think the intuition of your question is a good one, in that what are we going to do with this? What this will help you do, or at least it should, is to help you be able to plan for and budget, prospectively in a way that you are comfortable that even under normal variations in revenues or expenses, you would still be in compliance with the 1.25. So what kind of above and beyond 1.25, what's your comfort level that, you would still be able to be in technical compliance with that covenant?
And do you come to that also in knowing what kind of projected expenses are going to be coming in the future, say 5-10 years from now?
It doesn't often require that much forward thinking. I mean, it would depend a little bit on what was going on with the utility and how drastically things were changing. If you were on the cusp of something being, very different than it had been in the past, then it might be worth considering, a projection that far out. But where, even in the near term, when trying to plan for example, how you're going to fund, capital projects, what kind of debt service load your utility is comfortable carrying, what do rates need to be in order for you to be in compliance with this financial policy. That's where where the rubber meets the road, where it's going to be the most helpful to you.
So how far out are we looking at this projection right now?
So you don't need to look out. There's no looking forward. For the purposes of this financial policy, there is nothing written in it that says that it needs to be for some projected period out in the future. The implicit assumption is that you are planning for the next year. So 1 year out, you're there whenever your budgeting is happening, or any kind of financial decisions like setting of new rates or taking out of new debt obligations. This would be a helpful guidepost for you to use in those times to discern whether or not your existing whether or not that would be in compliance with your financial policy.
So we could adjust those accordingly if need be?
That's a good observation. All of these financial policies would be subject to revision by the board, at any time in the future. Generally speaking, utilities tend to adopt these, financial policies, and they stay in place, for, they're not permanent, but they don't change every year.
Right.
But they are always subject to revision by the board. And so this is not intended to lock you into some decision for forever, but rather just help you make decisions along the way as you're judging, you know, do we need this rate increase or don't we? Can we afford to take out this debt issue and pay for this capital project, or can't we? You know, it's just intended to help with those decisions that will come up from time to time.
Okay.
I think the other thing that the financial policies in general demonstrate to is, especially to a lender, is that we are doing everything we can to try to be responsible, you know, responsible managers of our financial situation.
Mm-hmm.
And
I agree with you.
yeah, so you know, if we were to adopt the debt service coverage of at least 1.50x, knowing that we can go below 1.25, but using the 1.5 as a target with, you know, if we go above or go below a little bit, we're in good shape and well above what our lender wants us to be. I guess the question that I've got is, given that we have, you know, you calculated, Grant, a 1.1 coverage ratio for last year, is how does that impact? I mean, what, you know, there's 14 basis points there of difference, and, you know, what's the multiplier in terms of our budget? How does that affect, you know, what we're doing with other things in our budget if we were trying to raise ourselves up to that 1.25 from the 1.1?
Right. Yeah, good question, Joe. And I just, before I touch on that, just to say, yeah, and these kinds of financial policies are the kinds of things that lenders of capital value and look at. In addition to the existence of the policies, they will tell you that they often, you know, in addition to just having the policies, do you actually comply with the policies and keep them consistent over time? Those are things that they also like to see, all things equal, and are, you know, just helps them get more comfortable with your decision making and your financial condition. Your question, Joe, you know, you would need to, well, first of all, it's a little bit apples and oranges in that the debt service coverage we're calculating now is based off your existing debt, and the CoBank bank loan as proposed would have different debt service obligations. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure how they would fall out, higher or lower. My vague recollections is they're lower, but that would have some impact on that calculation. If it's the case that you would, if it's the case that you will need to, in order to be in compliance with the CoBank loan covenants, that you just to get to 1.25, you may need to revisit your rate design and your level rates, or you know, expenses, to the extent that any are discretionary, in order to be able to achieve technical compliance with that covenant. The good news is that the utility is relatively unleveraged. So you may recall from this exact report that we're looking at, you know, there was an evaluation of how levered the utility is. I think it's the first thing in the report. Yeah, if you want to scroll up, Joe. You know, the utility is not particularly leveraged, especially as compared to other utilities. So what that means is that relatively, it should be relatively easier to get into compliance with the debt covenants, the debt service coverage ratio requirements, as compared to utility that may be more leveraged than your utility is. It's just going to be a dollar amount that's going to be more manageable than it would otherwise be. And just to kind of give you guys some perspective, I believe that based off of the, you know, projected preliminary draft. I don't know what other modifiers to put on that to make sure this isn't the answer. But according to the draft numbers that we were looking at before, if you were to take all of the available CoBank loan, take advantage of all of the lending that CoBank was willing to give to you, that would imply that you would be your annual debt service would be a little less than $50,000, meaning that your coverage at 1.25 is only like $13,000. It's relatively, small-ish dollars that we're talking about.
Yeah, because we're, it's not like, especially for this first set of money that's coming in or will be coming in, we're adding a whole lot. I mean, we're just going to be paying off the 200,000 or 195,000 that's left on the other loan. And then we're adding $150,000 in, additional debt with this first bit of money. So, I can even see where the debt, the debt has decreased $50,000 from 2017 to 2019. A lot of that's just our, regular payments, I guess, on what we've got, and that will be continuing. We haven't had much trouble, doing that at all. And as Mike has said in previous meetings, we're going to have the $350,000 available, or for paying off the other loan and then some other projects, but it doesn't add to our monthly cost at all. In fact, it reduces it a little bit, I believe, is what we thought, Mike, and in terms of our, the monthly payments that we have to make to, for that debt.
And so, Joe, I think you're right. And it's certainly, if you're just talking about I don't know how you guys have historically been talking about these. I'm looking at these CoBank as being 3 possible loans, the first 2 of which seems more certain to be taken down. Your debt obligations, if you're talking about just paying off what you've got now, and that first $150,000, the debt service on that is manageable, and therefore I think you would be able to pretty easily, without doing anything Herculean in terms of financial structuring or changes, meet the 1.25. I think the question is, for planning and budgeting purposes, what would you guys like to be targeting to give you some comfort level that small variations would still leave you in compliance with the required 1.25 floor?
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions just on the calculation, is that a yearly calculation?
Yes.
Or is it,
yeah, it's annual debt service, right?
so,
Or at least I'm not looking at the CoBank loan covenants right now, but historically they've always been, my experience has been they've always been annual calculations. I presume the CoBank one is as well. Not looking at the document, but I'm making that presumption, Mike.
and then on the variation, is a rule of thumb to use, or something that we need to go look at our historical expenses over time?
Yeah, it's another good question, Mike, and that right there boils down to kind of some of the preferences of the board members and what their comfort level is. So I have seen, I've seen debt service coverage targets, not bond covenants, but not covenanted requirements, but targets, from 1.35 to 1.75, or even in one case 2 times the debt service. Now, that's a pretty wide range there, and the particular circumstances around each of those bookends, the high and the low, are unique to that utility. But picking something that you're comfortable with, I think it's important to consider not just what is going to, because if you pick a higher number, you're less likely to, I don't want to say by accident, but due to small variations that are going to happen from year to year, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're not in compliance, but setting an unrealistically high requirement also would cause you to make decisions about either borrowing you might do or what rates need to be set that might artificially, be too much of a burden to get over for best, most efficient use of the capital of the utility. So I don't know if I explained that very well, but I think the upshot is this is kind of a personal preference. What's the feel of the board? How comfortable can the board get with this number versus that number?
I mean, 1.5 sounds reasonable to me, given that there's, reasonable expectation that we're not going to have any problem in the immediate term hitting that mark. I think that if or when we move forward with the extra $300,000 for the clarifier treatment tank, we might have to revisit that or revisit, that number and some other things in our budget. We have had, George was telling me that we've had, 46 homes in the last few years added to our, our service area. And that's put a lot of strain on a water plant and water system that was built for maybe 1 or 2 houses being built every year. And the clarifier is struggling to keep up. When we have hot weekends where a lot of people from out of town come into our neighborhood, like they did this last weekend, we have a hot, 95 degrees weather with people wanting to water their yards and what have you. And we have that number of new houses here. It's harder and harder for our facilities to keep up and with the water needs. And so I think I'm rambling a bit, but my point is that we may be, when we add that $300,000 to the $350 that we're going to be accepting here, hey, it may be that we need to, really revisit that target. But for now, you talk about the comfort, 1.5, based on what you've been telling me or talking with us about, does feel fairly, easy to get to. And it wouldn't, cause us too much, or if any, impact, especially since we'll have some additional revenues coming in from the loan to help us with our overall balance sheet.
Yeah, I don't, go, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say that I have to agree with you. I don't think the 1.5 target is unreasonable or too high. I think it gives us something to work towards.
All right, any other comments or questions? I mean, I don't know how we want to do this, Grant, if we want to just kind of say, let's go ahead and stick with the 1.5 that you've provided as a target.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Joe. I'm just making a note, and as we go through these, I'll kind of summarize what was discussed. If there was comfort around, for example, the 1.5, then that's great. If we get to some of these that are, less certain, then I'll make note of that, and you guys can, for future discussion and contemplation.
Okay.
Any other comments on the debt service coverage as a target? Okay. Well, feel free to speak up if you think of something as we're going through this. And again, I'm speaking to these first couple are ones that line up with things that you are, are coveting to in your upcoming CoBank loan. Some of these other ones don't have any external requirement on the utility. It will merely be, a best practice or a board comfort level. So if we get to any of these that you're just don't feel are necessary for the utility, that may be appropriate and okay too. But that one in particular seemed like a good one. Go ahead.
I had a question. So is like cash in the bank considered part of the revenue?
No, good question. Although interest income, I believe, would still be counted as part of your revenue. Cash sitting in the bank is not. So what this is testing is your ability to recover, all your debt service plus a little bit from your current rates. And so, having, ample cash sitting in the bank doesn't help you satisfy this requirement. Or it does only to the extent that you are earning interest income, which is kind of a minor contribution to that calculation.
Thanks.
Good question. So the other thing that I noticed in your proposed CoBank bond covenants, among other things that you're going to be required to do, these certainly weren't the only two, but the two that had a connection, in my view, to possible financial policies was around needing to make renewals and replacements on the system and as you're moving forward. So it said something to the extent of maintaining good repair and working order according to general practices. What's necessary in order to keep the utility in good working condition. That's not verbatim, but something along those lines is what is written into the covenants. And that's not atypical either, because the lender of capital wants to make sure that you are properly maintaining and renewing and reinvesting in the system to keep it in good working order, so that you're able to continue to provide adequate service and recover revenue to pay the debt service. This is also one of those items that in a way is connected to the first financial policy that we talked about, the debt service coverage. And that is because the coverage amount, the amount above 1, so if it's, if the policy is, if your target is 1.5 times debt service coverage, that extra 50 cents on the dollar generates additional, if you're satisfying that requirement, that means you have an additional 50 cents on the dollar available to pay in excess of debt service to use for some purpose. And presumably one of those purposes would or could be capital reinvestment back into the system. So the debt service coverage in essence is doing sometimes more than one thing. One, it's giving the lender comfort that you're going to be recovering from rates more than enough to pay the debt service itself, but it also can act as a source of funding for expenses beyond O&M, operations and maintenance expenses, to put back into the utility in order to keep it in good working condition. In your particular case, as we discussed previously, your utility is not very leveraged. The debt on the utility is relatively modest. And so as a result, the excess revenue beyond debt service that you're paying doesn't generate a whole lot of dollars that are available to be put back into the system in capital spending. For example, if it's the case that you're just using ballpark numbers, if you were to end up with all three CoBank loans outstanding, including the last 300 and some odd $1,000 one, your annual debt service payment would be in the neighborhood of $50,000 per year. And that would mean if your policy was to maintain 1.5 times debt service coverage, it would mean that in addition to the $50,000 debt service payment you're having to make, you're also generating an additional $25,000 that could be used, among other things, to pay for capital reinvestment. That $25,000, ballpark number is perhaps understating what capital reinvestment needs of the utility could be. For example, I believe that in 2017 or 2018, I think it was 2017, your depreciation expense was around $56,000. So that's more than double what level of spending that the $25,000 represent. Now, I'm not suggesting that depreciation is necessarily the ideal number to use for the planning of renewals and replacements of the system, but it is generally speaking in alignment with that idea and that concept. And so while for some utilities that debt service coverage might lend itself to sufficient capital reinvestment available for reinvestment, in your case, I'm not sure that it really does. So the question is, do you want to have a separate policy that speaks to the need to fund renewals and replacements of the utility system to make sure you're in compliance with and keep in compliance with first of all good industry practice, but also your bond covenants to CoBank. And that I'm going to stop there for questions before I kind of proceed on that issue, because that was a lot.
Yeah.
Mike, do you have, renewals and replacements? How does that, do you have any numbers on that in our budget? Or is that kind of a compilation of different?
I need to step away for a minute. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Anybody else want to ask a question while Mike's away for a moment?
George just in general talks about, and when we talk about renewals and replacements, Grant, would that be considered things like, valve and pipeline replacements? Or is it more heavy equipment replacements? I mean, how?
Yeah, good question, Joe. So it would be, for example, if you were wanting to, from the bottom up, develop an annual estimate of what you might want to have available for renewals and replacements on the system, one way to go about it is to look at, all right, how many feet of pipe do we need to replace annually in order to basically keep the system, renewing? How often do we have to inspect and paint tanks? How often do we need to replace meters? How often do we need to replace pumps? You would look at, the frequency and the level of investment necessary in order to make those renewals and replacements on the system. And then you would calculate an annualized average. because it's easy to miss some things. Well, let me before I say that, it is also true that the idea behind this is capital renewals and replacements, not maintenance activities. So if you're supposed to be exercising valves or doing something, as routine maintenance for the system, it's not really replacing, not a capital investment to replace something. I would categorize that slightly differently. And actually, there's that third bullet shown on the screen speaks to that type of investment. Ongoing, routine, preventative maintenance should be funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. That's something that you could also have as a policy, but that's kind of different than the capital spending that I'm envisioning or talking about with these renewals and replacements. So, in short of doing that kind of bottoms-up exercise of what are all the things we need to periodically replace and what's the schedule for replacing them, you can look to, and some utilities do, look to a shortcut to that process. And the best shortcut that we have available is your depreciation expense, because the depreciation expense is representing the wearing out of your fixed assets over time, over their useful lives. And so if your depreciation expense is $56,000, and you're planning for renewals and replacements is only $25,000, you can see that that may be, if the system is brand new and that you probably could get away with something, a mismatch like that, but eventually that level of reinvestment is going to lead to, over time, an aging of the system. Every year you're going to be a little bit further behind in the eventual replacement needs of the system. So eventually, at some point, if uncorrected for, your system would get into an aged condition where reliability would presumably, and level of service would presumably be impacted. So that's what you're trying to avoid, is getting behind on those activities to such an extent that it's more expensive in the long run to end up having to address emergency repairs and quality service issues.
We've had more problems this year. We haven't had quite as many problems with bad valves as much as we've had just with it's not that our pipes are being abused by the shifting of Windermere Oaks. We're getting breaks from land shifts, and the other problem that we've been getting is more having to reroute pipes because they were laid, as people move or change their platting on the lots, then we're having to move pipe and move valves. And so I'm just kind of talking out loud as to what we've seen more of this year. But last year we had some valves fail, and I know George has been trying to say that we need to pay more attention to ongoing replacement of valves, because we've got a lot of old valves out there that could fail at any time.
Yeah, and so that's a good observation, Joe. So, one way to go about this, as I said, is perhaps have a conversation with George and talk through what he thinks and feels are the renewal and replacement capital needs of the utility annually. And this is one of those numbers that is not going to be stagnant. It's not going to be the same, from one year to the next, because different stuff comes up and happens, and you're reacting to some of the conditions on the ground, which can be changing and evolving. but you'd like to, or at least my suggestion is that the board might want to plan for some annualized number that is at least representative of the need. If you can just get it in the ballpark of the need, you're in a lot better shape than if you are blind to it and are not accounting for it.
Gotcha. Mike, are you back?
Oh, sorry, Joe, go ahead.
I was just asking if Mike is back.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
We can,
Yeah.
And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on some of these, this discussion with, renewals and replacements and.
Well, I think Grant was touched on it a little bit about talking with George, because I think George puts a lot of these types of things into the 5-year plan. So a question I had was, if it is capital, is the idea to have enough capital so that way a large portion, say 20% or more, is available for the capital improvement? Or are you talking, or is it supposed to be a higher percentage of that than that?
Yeah, okay, that's a
Things can
good
be
question.
fairly expensive.
Yeah. So I would split it into two different concepts. There are capital projects to essentially just maintain the service that you have. If you've got a line that's in the ground that's failing and it needs to be replaced, you're just trying to put back into place facilities that will continue to provide the service that you're already providing. Some of your capital plan is undoubtedly tied to that to some degree, and I'm not looking at your capital plan, but just generally speaking, that's the case. But also often has in it things that are necessary to address, the expanding needs of the utility. So if you need a larger plant or a bigger pump station or a bigger tank or more storage, because not to serve the customers that you have today, but just because you've got customers tomorrow that are going to show up and you're going to need that. The funding need, I would put those into two separate buckets for thinking about this. Now, to your point, Mike, there is an opportunity, and it is not uncommon to have a financial policy around how much of the capital plan overall you're going to fund from cash versus borrowing. I would say that this utility, seemingly based on the fact that of the low leverage that the utility has, it seems to me that the utility has prioritized cash funding, significant portions of the capital plan in the past, and so that comes with its own set of pros and cons. But the utility might choose to say, all right, we're gonna, and actually the fourth bullet point on the screen that's shown here kind of speaks to that idea, is that for capital projects, we're gonna have at least 15% equity contribution as opposed to borrowing from debt. And again, these are just placeholder scarecrow type placeholder values for your consideration. I am not trying to dictate to you guys what you should be targeting there, but yeah, that might be another policy. And so you might have several different policies that speak to or have an impact on what you debt finance versus what you cash finance. The decision to debt finance, something might be in compliance with all your financial policies except for debt service coverage, or some other. You might have more than one financial policy And the idea is to kind of, and they're not all exactly the same. They have different roles and they fit into the overall picture differently. So you kind of, in the combination, in aggregate, if you're staying in alignment with these financial policies, it would help you guide the decision about, for example, Mike, how much of that capital project should you be cash funding versus debt funding. And so the financial policy here is less about how you're going to fund it, whether it's going to be from cash or from debt. For example, in the covenant that's written into the CoBank loan document, it doesn't say anything about where the dollars to pay for this need to come from. It just says that the utility needs to be planning for this. It needs to be making plans for the ongoing renewals and replacement needs of the utility. It doesn't say, you need to plan for it and you need to pay cash for it. So I kind of want to separate out those ideas, and maybe they'll make it into different financial policies that you adopt. But what I'm asking about right now, at least initially, is, does it make sense to put in a policy that says something about the need of the utility to recognize and plan for the renewal and replacement needs of the utility? And that's a question. That's, again, these are all subject to the board's discretion and thinking on this.
I think there is a need for that myself. And I believe that previous boards pretty much did not recognize that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's previous boards might talk about five-year plan, is that there wasn't a dollar figure associated with the 5-year plan, and how you were going to get there with what you wanted to do. We've knocked out 2 or 3 things in the previous 5-year plan, in the last year. And so I think if we had a policy, like, for instance, item number 4, if we had an equity contribution ratio of at least 15%, and I put the calculator up here because I was thinking, we spent $85,000 in cash on a generator that's supposed to last, 20 years. I mean, it's there. It's going to last a long time. We spent $10,000 on security system that has should have a expected lifespan of 10 years or more. It depends on what technologies they roll out, and if anybody in the future wants to get fancier than what we got. We just added a new SCADA system for $20,000, all out of our operating budget and reserves. So if we had some sort of a policy, and I know that's not talking about what you're talking about, Grant, renewals and replacements, but in some sense it is, especially with the SCADA system. But if we were to have 15% of that 115,000 covered in cash, instead of laying out 115,000, we would have laid out 17,000 in cash and financed the rest, with debt. And theoretically, I mean, we can talk about the useful life of these assets and, what components should be considered long-term versus short-term. But I'm talking, in kind of, I'm trying to bring this down into additional real life ways to apply some of these things. I don't know if I'm being helpful or not.
Oh, that is helpful. And actually, the first bullet on this list might also speak to something else that you were touching on, Joe, which is, the term of debt generally should not exceed the useful life of the asset. So, for example, for something that you think is going to last 10 years, it doesn't make sense to put 30-year debt on it. Again, this is not an issue that your utility has historically had. If anything, you've had the opposite. You've been at the opposite extreme of that policy. But there again, just as a good practice for future board members, that as a general rule, you wouldn't want to finance things beyond their useful life. Is just kind of a good rule of thumb to be considered by the board as a possible policy.
Yeah, and for that particular policy, we might want to break it down into different categories of assets. There's a software asset, that have, and I don't know if this is right, Grant, in terms of how you might recommend it based on what you see with other utilities, but there's a software technical component to the security system and the SCADA system that we put in. That's a big chunk of money, $30,000, but in terms of its useful life, our last SCADA system and computer lasted about, 8 years, 6 or 7 years, something like that. And then kind of became obsolete based on, how technology has progressed. So I don't know if there's different strata of, policies that we should put on assets and asset purchases.
Well, I think that's where he was saying that, each time something comes up, generally you're going to want to make that decision of where to get your money to spend on it based on the likelihood of how many years it's going to be good, right?
Yeah, and you also have the opportunity to dictate, for example, if you were going to finance something very significant that it made sense based on your cash position or many other factors or intergenerational equity reasons, or for many reasons you might want to debt finance it. If it's going to last for 15 years, you can finance the debt for 15 years instead of 30 years, for example.
Right.
What you don't want to be in the situation to do is paying debt service on assets that are no longer in service because they've been, obsolete and removed and replaced by something else. That's just that is kind of contrary to equitable intergenerational equity issues.
So, for the policy, we wouldn't really go in and dictate particular items, but the policy might contain the language to say to consider the life of this asset in determining how to pay for it, or, whether it be the cash or pay as you go or financing.
Right, I agree with that. The idea here is not to be overly prescriptive for, or dictate to future boards. It is more to give kind of rules of the road and guideposts to go make decisions by, rather than dictate specifics.
The goal overall is to make these determinations so there's sustainable, because we are dealing with a infrastructure that is, has had a number of years already in operation. And so I think that's our thing, is to make sure that, we continue to have it to where we can renew and refresh things as necessary so that, it's sustainable and it can continue to serve, when those of us that are here now are no longer here.
Well said. So I'm happy to take more questions, but I also might offer a suggestion on this piece of it. I guess before I go down that road, any other comment, discussion on that idea?
Not for me.
Not
So
me either.
okay, so either in conjunction with a statement or a financial policy around rate recovery. One of the proposed bullets, and I don't know what bullet number it is there, Joe, but it's on the next page, is that rates shall be designed to generate sufficient revenues to support the full cost of operations and debt, provide debt service coverage, and meet other debt covenants if applicable, ensure adequate and appropriate levels of reserves and working capital. If that's something that you guys would like to adopt for financial policy, that language is available. It also could be, reworded to better fit your needs and desires. But it's also possible you could supplement that statement by something along the lines of, further, even though rates are developed for the utility under the cash basis, depreciation shall be included as a necessary cost to be recovered in rates in order to ensure a minimum level of funding for capital reinvestment to make all renewals, replacements, and improvements necessary to ensure the utility remains in good working condition. And for that purposes of kind of giving you a template placeholder of that idea, I've used the idea of using depreciation as the yardstick, but it need not be that. It could be something else. It could be, some other basis that you could work up, with George.
Grant, you're breaking
We've
up.
lost you.
Grant,
Yep. Can you hear
We've
me?
lost you.
Sorry about that. How about now?
Not yet.
Okay.
We lost you where you were saying that depreciation, you ran through depreciation as one option, but then I think I heard you say that, another, policy might be to get together with George or something to, work out other, and that's where we lost you.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.
There you are.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
What
we
I
got you.
was that it need not be depreciation that you use as the yardstick for judging this. It could be something else that you develop in-house with George and between yourselves. But for the purposes of giving you something to think about and chew on and respond to, I've phrased that policy around using depreciation, which might be more or less than you really need realistically to stay on top of your renewal and replacement needs of the utility.
I like the depreciation tool, and I like it because I'm not convinced that that was done in previous decision making around rate. I don't know whether it was, because I don't have a financial policy document that was conveyed by any previous board as to why they adjusted rates beyond just the TRWA worksheet. And Mike, I seem to recall that James Smith considered our depreciation low and not appropriate to replenishing for the ongoing preservation of our system.
I don't recall that.
What's that?
I said I don't remember what James thought.
Anecdotally,
It's fuzzy.
yeah, anecdotally, based off of the original cost, the gross plant and service that you have as a utility, the depreciation that you recognize in 2017 of around $56,000 does seem a little bit low compared to what I might expect depreciation expense to be based on, you know, the overall level of your capital investment in the utility to date. However, saying that, I don't have a real firm understanding of what all of your utility assets are. So it could be that it's more appropriate than I appreciate. But when I just look at it, you know, out of the box without any prior preconceptions or notions, it does seem a little low compared to what I would expect. Maybe that's the best way to state that. So that may be a different issue, Joe, for you guys to think about. You know, whether or not that's the right yardstick to use in this policy, if you adopt it, also might be a different question as well.
Grant, what I don't understand about, and I guess this is for Grant and Mike, what I don't understand is why we would have depreciation in one year and not the subsequent years. So why would we have it in 2017 and not have it in 2018 and 2019?
So my presumption, Joe, is that the report I have seen for your financials didn't state that number, but my presumption is that you know, by the time you closed your books, that number became available or was recognized somewhere. I mean, whether you did or did not formally recognize a depreciation amount on your financials is, you still did have depreciation. Real, all your assets got 1 year older. Whether you recognized it financially on your books or not, it's kind of a separate issue. But from my perspective, you know, the aging of the utility did happen, and that's what we're trying to address. But yeah, I don't have that's my best hypothesis for the more recent years financial statements on that issue.
So Joe, we can ask Tim about that.
Yeah, we should, I think, because to me, you know, it is a number that is calculable and something that, you know, future boards should, you know, pay attention to. And if we write it into a policy, it certainly creates that. I mean, to me, it's a useful measure of your aging, you know, your aging infrastructure. And, you know, I think more should be made of it, quite honestly. Here's my other concern is that, you know, and we talked about this some last year, you know, George is a key man for our organization, but you know, you never know. You know, it's hard to rely, you know, believe that George is going to be around, you know, Windermere forever. And so therefore, you know, the alternative process, Grant, that you were talking about in terms of work with George on some of these things, it doesn't compute to me in terms of a long-term reliable solution for future boards.
Yeah, the way that could be, you know, translate from one board to the next board if they look at the analysis done and replicate it over time. They might change some of the pieces or change the number of years that it, you know, between activities. Or they could modify it and evolve it over time, from as appropriate. The reason why depreciation gets used so often for this purpose is because it's easy. It doesn't require anyone to do this bottoms up thinking that we're talking about, any kind of bottoms up analysis of what the needs are of the utility. And maybe in certain situations that bottoms up analysis is the right thing to do, because you need to be able to recognize the utility where it actually is today, not a theoretical place that it should be based on an assumed useful life assumption for the utility. So I mean, there can be disconnects, but the depreciation is something that's relatively easy to calculate, is typically already available, and then just makes it an easier shorthand way to get to that purpose without doing something more detailed or elaborate.
I mean, should the consideration for this time be the more detailed, and then have the policy set to where in the future it would be based on depreciation?
Yeah, this is completely up to you. This is up to you guys. So
I mean, it seems like it would be good to do kind of an overarching analysis of all the structures that we have and what that might mean in terms of replacement and when. I don't know. This is just kind of that discussion.
Yeah, well, and that's why again, bringing it back to my introductory comments, I think Joe's as well. I'm not suggesting you guys take action on any of this. The purpose of this is to get you guys thinking about these issues and get the discussion going. So that's a good observation. I will tell you this. There are two situations where depreciation can be misleading. If your system is brand new and was just installed, then depreciation is going to tend to over-represent what you really need to be putting back into the utility to renew and replace it, at least in the beginning. Because you're going to, if it was all new, the 1 year in, you're not really replacing, pumps that last 10, 15 years, or, things like that were not going to come up. On the other side, if you happen to be way behind on addressing, aging infrastructure, then depreciation, especially if it's depreciation on long-lived assets that were put into service 20, 25 years ago, depreciation may be understating what your actual needs are. One, because you may be behind, and two, because capital costs tend to increase over time. The replacement for whatever you're looking at may cost twice as much as what it cost you to put it in originally. And right. So you can get, there are certainly times when that easy rule of thumb depreciation can get you in trouble. Those tend to be the extremes on one or the other.
Well, when I apply that to, kind of our situation, I can't, because I don't have enough familiarity with some of the insides of the assets inside the water plant. But I mean, we do have relatively new, wastewater treatment plant, relatively new, water plant within the last, 10, 15 years. So it's not like it's old, but it's not like it's ancient. The main thing that we're having trouble with is, say, our clarifier, which is ancient and inadequate to our growth problem or our growth, trajectory.
Yeah,
That's
and
what
Joe, I want to be
to
clear.
talk to you.
Okay.
Well, what I wanted to ask about is, how does depreciation handle, growth or expected growth of a water company?
Yeah, it doesn't. You hit the nail on the head, Joe. Is that having to expand the facilities to meet growth is not depreciation is not equipped to represent that cost. The renewals and replacements of the system are just to keep going in perpetuity the system you have now. If you need a bigger system to handle new customers, then that needs to be addressed differently, presumably through a combination of capital contribution by the customer or equity buy-in or impact fee or something, combination of that, and the utility potentially taking out debt to fund that expansion and paying it out over time as that asset is used and useful to all customers, including the new ones.
Yeah, there's so many big questions that we're grappling with here, Grant, and we just heard about land that we're thinking about maybe marketing.
Joe,
But then we had a weekend like we did this weekend where we had a tremendous amount of coming up. Was this better?
Yeah, you were breaking up, so I'm not sure what you were saying.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm trying to just say that we are caught in a number of cross currents between growth and the relative differences in age of some of our assets. So I guess my challenge for you, Grant, and coming back to us with something of a policy is to consider that we have a system that is young but not real young, a little less than middle age, I would say, in most respects. But we have some assets that are really old and not up to the challenge of our potential growth curve. And I'm thinking specifically about the clarifier, which is a $500,000 ticket. So I don't know if that gives you any guidance or if our other board members have any other thoughts on how we can make this policy support those conflicting or disparate, challenges.
Well, I think the other thing that we can consider in terms of growth is that, Windermere is a limited, so there's only so many lots left that can be built on. So we have that as kind of a guiding thing as terms of how much growth.
Well, that's right. But I think we have, the amount of growth could be significant. I still think that there's probably still 100 lots out there where we've had maybe 200 lots. I know that we had 350 lots at one point, and 220-ish or 200-ish were, had houses on them, which leaves, another 100, possibly another 100 lots out there for, for growth.
Well, and I think that's where a lot of this is contingent on, doing some research on a lot of this stuff to kind of figure out what's the next step here based on updating ourselves on that information, whether it's the build out and how much growth that could potentially be to infrastructure wise, you know, what's the valuation and the length of life for all of the various factors, whether it's the pipes in the ground or the water treatment plant or the wastewater treatment plant or whatever.
Yeah, I think the growth is kind of, should be dealt with a little bit separately from renewing and replacing, maintaining what we have. And so I think they're kind of separate calculations. And I think the loans that we have here, we have to make sure that we are addressing the renewal and replacement of what we have, right? Because that's what we have the loans for.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. And to be clear, you don't have to have a financial policy around this, but that is something that is in your covenants to CoBank, or will be if you close on that loan. It says that you're going to be accounting for that and planning for it. Not that you have a financial, you don't have to have a financial policy around it, but the idea is that you're thinking about it and make sure that you are achieving satisfactory renewals and replacements on the system to keep it in good working condition long term. And so this one, financial policy may not address, for example, Joe, the needs for growth on the system and how to fund it. You can have different financial policies that might speak to that. But this one in particular wouldn't tell you anything or wouldn't dictate anything to future boards or as to how to plan for or accommodate growth. There may be other policies that would speak to that.
And that's fine. That's fine, Grant. But I would like for I'd like for any document that we produce for future boards to make that clear, to make it clear that this financial policy does not incorporate a growth component, and that they would have to, come up with something to address those needs as they emerge. I think that that's an important footnote or modifier somewhere to let boards know that this is not intended to help on that issue.
Well, and I think that it could be, that this is a work in progress. So we may not have that in place initially when we have to do some of these things, but then that's something that we strive to work on and get that worked out for the growth as a separate thing, but as part of a policy.
Works for me.
So the policy that might speak to that, and I'm certainly open to continuing to answer any questions about a potential policy around renewals and replacements. But the policy that I'm envisioning that might best speak to growth is, how will major capital improvements going forward be financed? And I think it was the fourth bullet on the prior page, Joe, if you want to scroll up a little bit. Does anyone have any feedback or comments on a policy that might look something like that, or questions about what was the template for discussion that was laid out in that fourth bullet?
Well, Grant, I think on that fourth bullet, that's really the intergenerational matter. Isn't that what that is addressing?
Yep.
And isn't that, I think that, a lot of people would be interested, a lot of our members would be interested to know that, hey, we're trying not to charge you now for something that you may not be around for 15 years from now. And so I like that particular bullet as it's, really as it's written. If 15% is the you know, kind of an industry standard, I'm very happy with that.
Yeah, I don't want. I've seen 15%. I've seen higher percents as well. I don't know that I've seen lower, but you know, I could imagine a lower one being acceptable. So this here again is open to discussion and feedback from the board as to whether it's 15% or some other number. But I do think that this is a helpful policy for future boards to be able to help make decisions around things like, for example, you know, expanding the water treatment plant to meet, you know, the growth from those, you know, 100 new customers that may show up one day. You know, this would be helpful to that in that regard.
Well, I mean, I think just in this little example that I did, you know, even if it's, you know, if we think about that 80, you know, is it what, 85,000 or so generator that we had to buy, mostly for regulatory reasons, right, for compliance. And, you know, instead of paying cash, you know, we had it as a policy, okay, let's go ahead and go to CoBank and seek to, you know, fund that generator for, you know, $85,000, and we'll, you know, put up, you know, 12.7 right now, you know, and knowing that it's a long-term asset. I mean, to me, that 15% number is, you know, it makes sense. It's a good indication of good faith with any lender, of, you know, of meeting current needs, but also then recognizing that the people paying for it now may not be the long-term users of it. So, I mean, I think that that's a fair number. I don't know that there's real reason to go higher or lower from 15. Truly.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, Joe, on that.
Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I think 15 to 20% is what most people would think of. I haven't talked to financial institutions, but just off the top of my head, I would think that would be in the ballpark.
Okay.
Yeah, and the only thing I might
Dorothy,
do.
anything?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just asking.
What were you going to say?
The only thing I was reading it, and the one thing I might add to this potentially, subject to you guys. I mean, this is your policy, so by all means, I might put a modifier at the beginning of this to say major capital projects rather than just capital projects. Only so that we're clear that, you know, if you've got some minor capital, you know, $5,000, you don't need to go out and get a loan for 85% of it because of this policy. This is envisioned to be, you know, major capital improvements, not, you know, everything that happens to be capitalized on your system. Does my rationale and explanation make sense there?
It does to me, yes.
Yeah, so would we, you know, maybe put a dollar amount, major capital over X amount of dollars to be applied?
You could, you know, you could leave it ambiguous, not for the purposes of being opaque, but rather to allow future boards to have some flexibility there. Or you could pick a dollar amount that you think is appropriate for, you know, consideration of implementation of this requirement. I guess it kind of depends a little bit on how prescriptive you guys want to be, you know, on this. You know, obviously spelling out a dollar amount would be more prescriptive than leaving it to the judgment of future boards what a major capital project is.
Well, I mean, I just think that it might be a better guideline if we sort of have a an amount that, is a capital improvement project and above. So that, somebody can't come through and say, okay, this is a capital improvement, we're going to borrow for $5,000 or something. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if we're going to start implement things, we need to, I think, really, sort of implement these things from the get-go.
Grant,
I hear you.
Grant, what would make sense, instead of setting a dollar amount, what might make sense as a percentage amount, like percentage of revenue, percentage of free cash flow, percentage of, some other measure. I hate to, I just hate, inflation happens. Unique things like steel prices quadrupling in a couple of years because of trade policies happen. And so I'd rather not burden a board with a specific dollar amount as more of a guideline about, a capital project being a certain percentage of, this, X ratio or X financial measure. And I just don't know what would make sense in that.
And a lot of that too, won't it? I mean, it'll be the financial standing of the corporation when that decision needs to be made by that future board. It's like, where are they financially compared to, I mean, we can look at it from our perspective of where we are now, but it's like, we don't know in 5 years or 10 years what the board might be looking at. So I almost hesitate to put a specific dollar amount because, it's going to be a judgment call at that time.
Okay, well, maybe not I'm just saying that maybe we need to set in place some sort of guidelines that, dictate what a capital improvement project is and what it isn't. That's all I'm saying.
Right.
And I think that's a good observation. However, I don't want this financial policy to supplant any current practices of the utility. For example, I don't know what it is because I haven't looked into it, but undoubtedly the utility has a threshold set for what is or is not capitalized on your system. It is likely, it is almost certainly based on, one, the useful life of what's being acquired, meaning if it's only going to last for a year or less, it's going to be expensed no matter how much it costs. If it's a filter you have to buy every single year and it costs, $50,000, even though it's a big dollar amount, it doesn't last long enough to be capitalized, so it wouldn't be. And then also a dollar amount threshold. So you might buy a bolt that's going to be there for 50 years, but it only costs $1. So you're not going to bother capitalizing things that are that insignificant in dollar amount. So I don't know what your policies are that currently dictate what thresholds are met to capitalize something on your system. And so I'm reticent to set a policy that might go and become in conflict with that unintentionally. But undoubtedly that does exist.
Yeah, but buying a filter, of a consumable kind of thing wouldn't be considered, in my opinion, a capital improvement project because that's a consumable. But I'm just, trying to protect the water company because I don't think we've had anything in place on what's considered capital and what's not. So, and we don't have to do a dollar amount. We could, I'm just throwing it out there because we're talking about this and need to set some precedents.
I agree. Well, there must be something at work at some level because you have capital assets on your balance sheet, and they got there by someone deciding to capitalize them. So I don't know what the rules are that they got you to where you are. But yeah, I merely don't want to be in conflict with them. And that is my primary reason for recommending that you perhaps consider not putting a specific dollar amount into the financial policy. Joe's points are also well taken on that regard as well.
Yeah, and that's all good. I think we can all come to an agreement on what would be the best route to go. So just throwing it out there.
Okay.
It's not my way or the highway.
Okay. Well, do we feel like, I guess what I'm hearing from you guys is that we need a desire to define, if we're going to use the nomenclature major capital project in such a proposed financial policy, the need to define, I guess, major capital project in some form or fashion. Is that what I'm hearing?
Would it be just making, like an example, giving them a reference as an example? And listing a couple of examples of what we're referring as major capital projects?
Yeah, that might be a good solution. The obvious examples probably wouldn't need defining. It's trying to find the marginal project that best says, all right, here's the cutoff between what we consider major or not major. And in that respect, the easiest thing to do is put a dollar amount on it. But
well, that's what I was saying. But like, right? But like a filter is not, even if it costs $50,000, that's a consumable that has to be purchased. That's not a capital improvement. We define what a capital improvement is. I'm not sure, because I'm not savvy at how this language goes, but there's got to be a way that we can impose that in our thing going forward, because somebody can interpret a capital improvement even though they don't understand bookkeeping, and that it will never be depreciated, so therefore it's not a capital improvement and it's just an expense.
You're 100% right about that. Yeah, I appreciate your example, and I agree with you. That wouldn't be a capital item because of the nature of the life of the item. So maybe my hypothetical example about must live, must be a life beyond 1 year and greater than X dollars, is the best way to help define what we're talking about.
Okay, well, I'd be interested in seeing that language for sure. Dorothy, you good with that?
Yes.
Joe?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm good.
Mike? Just so we can clarify it a little better and,
So
and
Brent's
embellish.
gonna make a proposal. Is that what I heard?
Well, I think this is just for discussion for us to have him come back again to us and, present what we're planning to do, correct?
That's
Yeah, I could take this and write it out and send it to you guys for your consideration. And we can certainly have another meeting to discuss it if that would be helpful. But yeah, what I'm hearing right now is, major capital projects being defined as greater than 1 year in life, and then pick a dollar amount that might be not too reflective of, you don't want to put this onto low dollar amount items, this requirement onto low dollar amount items. So
Right.
do you guys have a internal feel about what dollar amount is too small to worry about applying this rule to?
Well, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think anything under $50,000 might be something that isn't necessarily a capital improvement. If we're talking filters and things that are considered somewhat consumables, that have a shelf life of, or, a life of less than a year or 2 years or whatever it is, that's not a capital improvement, it's a filter. And I'm just using that as an example.
But
Well,
so I'm asking the question though, but if you had an expense that was $10,000, but the life of it was 10 years or less, I mean, yeah,
It's really gray, but then would you rather expense it? So that's
leave
kind of
that
like
up to the board at that year, right?
yeah, and that's a bookkeeping
Budget,
thing. Yeah.
Mike, what did you say?
I think you can leave that up to that board at that year, if they want to go ahead and pay for it as they go versus, getting or counting it as capital, even if they do pay for it all at once.
Right.
They want to depreciate it, So it really depends in my mind as to what the item is.
Yeah, and I agree. And
Businesses I've worked for, they've often used $10,000 as a rough number. If it's above that and it's not a item that's going to just be used, right? It's going to last years. Then they'll count it as capital.
well, and I
Yeah,
think we can get some guidance from our CPA as well, too, or maybe make that part of it, that you need to have some guidance from the CPA firm before you make a decision, or have some guidance on how this is going to best affect our taxes.
Yeah, and my I just
Well,
want
we
to
don't pay
interject
taxes,
there.
right? So
Well, I mean, but I know what you mean. I mean, I don't mean taxes, but just the bottom line.
I think it's probably one of the reasons why the depreciation wasn't readily
Yeah.
available, right?
Right.
Probably so, yeah.
So I want to make sure to interject this here, that my suggestion around this will be merely for the purposes of the financial policy, and will not change any kind of practices the utility has or the CPA has around what they do or do not capitalize. So I don't want to mix those two. I think there are legitimate things that your CPA should be capitalizing for you that I would not consider to be major capital projects for which this financial policy would be applicable. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that,
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
these
I
rules
agree.
would just be for the purposes of interpreting the policy, not in setting rules for the utility to follow for what they do or don't capitalize. So
Right. Right. No, I agree with that. I think we need guidance from our CPA.
I will write that out then in a way that makes sense to me based on the feedback that you guys have given, which has been helpful. Thank you. And I think the only, I guess I'm open to other questions on that, but the one last thing that I was going to bring up with you guys was a policy around your operating reserve or cash working capital. So this will usually be measured in days of days cash on hand, and a day of cash is basically your cash O&M expenses divided by 365 days a year. So whatever you spend on an annual basis for O&M, cash O&M, divided by the days in the year gives you 1 day of cash on hand. And so how many days of cash on hand you are going to maintain can vary significantly depending on your cost structure and the risk profile of the utility. It is also somewhat dependent upon whether you have one policy for cash operating reserves, or if you have several smaller policies that speak to, we're going to have a a capital reserve with 1 year of depreciation or half a year of depreciation in it. We're going to have an emergency reserve with 30 days of O&M expenses in it. You know, if you're going to have several policies that relate to the number of days or the dollar amounts that you're going to have on hand, or alternatively, if you're going to have one overarching policy that says, you know, we're going to target this many days cash on hand. And I guess I'm saying that because if you're going to have one kind of overarching policy, you don't want to add on top of that smaller policies that in the aggregate make the overall balances larger than you really intended, if that makes any sense. So I guess with that kind of introduction to this idea, and I have other thoughts on this, but I guess, do you have feedback or thoughts on whether or not you want to have, for example, a policy around, you know, working capital plus an emergency reserve plus a capital reserve, or what are your thoughts on having multiple reserves that all detail different, maybe smaller dollar amounts or days, or one overarching, you know, policy that covers all of that?
Just real quick, Grant, is this needed for the CoBank loans, the days cash on hand?
No, it is not. This is not a. You have a requirement to set aside dollars in a debt reserve, which would be a restricted reserve that is not included in this policy or in these amounts calculated. So this has nothing to do with anything that you are by covenant required to do for CoBank. It is, however, a very good practice to have some policy around, you know, what kind of cash on hand the utility should maintain for, you know, financial stability. You know, it is hard to judge whether the utility has the right amount of cash on hand or liquid investments on hand without a policy like this to measure that against. And so the idea is to put in place a financial policy so that future boards will be able to assess whether or not they have sufficient or insufficient cash on hand to maintain the financial stability of the utility. And really the idea is that this is what will help to pay for emergency events that may arise, emergency, you know, capital needs of the utility, unexpected or unplanned expenses and or reductions in revenue. You know, this is kind of, you can think about it as like your personal checking account. You'd like to have something more than $1 in there to be able to accommodate unexpected events as they come along. There's also true that just in the nature of the water business, there are times of the year when you're bringing in substantially more revenue than others. Presumably in the summer, you're selling more water and have more revenue coming in than in some of the other months of the year. But a lot of your expenses are much more fixed in nature. You know, other than chemicals and electricity, you're likely writing checks for O&M expenses that are pretty similar month in, month out, whether you're selling a lot more water or not. So this is this lends the ability of the utility to be able to accommodate, you know, fluctuations, natural fluctuations in your cash flow, in addition to unexpected things.
I'm going to scroll up, Grant, to our history of cash on hand. And, you know, personally, I think that, 122 days and 124 were way too much in those particular years, because really you're losing, if there are opportunities to reinvest in your company, in particular assets, this is too much of cash just sitting around, and you're missing opportunities to change valves, or buy a new SCADA system or whatever that would have a longer life and give you better service. I wonder, we're talking here about 90 days. I mean, I just don't, I know that that's kind of a offhand, generally accepted principle. I don't know if it applies appropriately to us, or, I think we've been running, I looked at our recent report, we're running at almost 70 days cash on hand. I don't know how that number makes Mike feel as he's managing the the day-to-day cash flow of the organization with incoming and outgoing bills. And the problem even with this number right now is simply that so much of it's so low because we're trying to do everything we can to pay legal bills. And so I'm just kind of throwing out a number of different, X factors to, for us to think about as we think through these reserves, replacement reserves, and operating cash reserves. A lot of it to me is, based on a lot of my consideration of what these should be really hinges on Mike's consideration of how comfortable he feels with where our bank accounts are at, different points of the year.
Well, I think one of the things that we had not previously considered is some of the topics we had talked about here today. Yeah, especially the working capital. So the item we were previously discussing about, renewal and replacement, and what our targets will be for how much of that should be in cash and how much of that should be in debt. So that'll be part of the cash part, will be part of the day's cash on hand, along with an emergency fund, as well as any months of O&M we want to have, as well as any variation on top of that for unplanned expenses and revenue decreases. So 90 days doesn't sound like it would cover all of that for water treatment plant and wastewater treatment plant.
Yeah, and Mike, I appreciate that comment, especially because it was one of the last, if not the last question about this topic I was going to have for you guys, which is when I was calculating for the purposes of this report, your day's cash on hand, I had removed items that were dollar, balances tied to capital purposes. So, let me back up. My expectation is not that you necessarily go out and segregate and create separate bank accounts or accounts for these various purposes. This can all be in one, commingled balance, or, with money market funds, or whatever that makes the most sense for your utility in terms of managing your liquid assets. But if you have some portion of that total that is earmarked, either explicitly restricted or just kind of tacitly tagged as being associated with a capital project or future capital projects, my tendency would be to not count those dollars in this calculation. In other words, this would be on unrestricted cash balances, or cash balances that are not tied to specific capital needs of the utility. And that's how I had performed the calculation in this report. That would somewhat address what you were mentioning there, Mike. So if you know that some portion of these dollars is really earmarked or intended to be used for capital projects, then taking those dollars out of consideration for this balance in the calculation of this, financial policy would somewhat address, I believe, what I believe you were referring to there or alluding to there, Mike, which might make the 90 days more meaningful or helpful to the utility than it would be if we didn't take the step of, making a differentiation between funds that are earmarked for a purpose, a capital purpose, or not. For example, I'll give you one last example. You are required to hold a certain number of dollars in a debt reserve, as part of your CoBank covenants. It's not one of the covenants that we discussed for the financial policies, but it exists out there. Because those dollars are really held for that purpose, they're not really available in that sense for the utility to spend on something else. And for that reason, I wouldn't include those cash balances in this calculation as a kind of a further example of that. Does that make sense to you guys?
I think that helps. What
Yeah.
was your guidance on the months of O&M?
Sorry, Mike, did you ask what was my suggestion?
Yes.
So I have most often seen something between 90 days and 120 days, assuming that you're not going to have these additional add-on reserves for emergencies or for capital, around the edges. If it's kind of one holistic number intending to represent, the working capital needs of the utility, it's usually, but not always, in that range of 90 to 120 days. So from that standpoint, Joe, 120 days didn't look to me to be like more than, could you get away with less? Probably, but it didn't seem unusual when I saw that come out of the analysis of your historicals. Where you guys are now tends to feel to me, especially if you do the calculation by setting aside any dollars that you have to for the debt reserve or for tied to any capital planning that if there's any other capital spending that is going to be done out of that balance that you have now, once you take that out, I think where you guys are now in your cash on hand and liquid investments on hand, may be on the low end of what I typically see. Now, if you're comfortable with it, then this may be the place to be setting, at least initially setting, the financial policy. The idea here is to set a target floor. Unlike your bond covenants, you're not going to be in technical default or anything like that if you fall below that floor, but you're trying to set a threshold at which you're wanting to stay above in order to stay comfortable with your financial condition. Did that help answer your question, Mike?
Yes. Yeah, you did.
Grant, at one point last year, we got above, we got to 200 days of cash on hand. And, that made us recognize, or allowed us to recognize that, yeah, we could go ahead and buy that generator, and that we could engage with LCRA with some projects that would return we put out $34,000 in a commitment, and they would give us $14,000 to complete the projects, which I thought was a pretty good, commitment. But we moved forward with that because we had so much cash on hand, at the time. What I would suggest, and given our situation, with legal expenses, that maybe we set a minimum and maximum, and these are targets, I recognize, but 70 days minimum, and 120 days is what I think you said is as maximum before you really start aggressively looking for say debt repayment or something with that extra.
Yeah,
So,
and Joe, just to be clear, that range that I gave you was not an upper, it wasn't a lower end, high end. I mean, it was a range of the floor. It was a range of the low ends. So, it is not often that a utility will set a maximum in their financial policy.
Okay.
It is, I guess, understood that the utility board will make prudent financial decisions with cash balances in the future, and either pay down debt or pay for future capital projects that might otherwise have been debt funded, or forego rate increases until cash balances are drawn back down. So it is not typical to see an upper end of the range. You shouldn't hold any more than this dollar amount in the reserve. The range I gave you was no less than this number or no less than this other number, not a no more than ceiling. There was no ceiling I was suggesting there.
got it.
I kind of like your idea there, Joe. It's more for future boards to understand that when they have this amount of days cash on hand, they ought to be looking at how best to utilize it instead of just growing.
Get it open?
Yeah, I mean, just my experience is, I mean, I see what you're saying, Grant, and Mike, just my experience, it's just been our experience here, right? Of saying, it's one of these things that allows members,
Cutting in and out.
hey, we have cash on hand. We have cash on hand for different reserves, but we also recognize that at some point we may need to move forward with other types of reinvestments in our system.
Let me ask the rest of the board, what are your thoughts on Joe's suggested range of 70 days to 120 days? What are your feelings on that?
Well, in my opinion, I like the idea of that. I don't like the idea of doing different tiers. I think one general would be a lot smarter for us to start with. And I'm good with what Joe's suggested, and I bow to Mike's opinion as well.
Just one recent or fairly recent data point we had, and this is in regards to the emergency fund, is our intake barge was taken out by a severe storm that flooded the lake, and everything came washing on down and took out our barge. And that was a good $75,000 or so emergency kind of unplanned expense. And so I kind of lean a little bit more towards the 90 days than the 70 days. just because, you know, we do get unexpected storms around here from time to time. And a lot of the other things that happen around here are fairly expensive.
Right.
And so just for emergency fund alone, I'm thinking we need at least like 75K.
Okay, well, like I said, Mike, I bow to you. You know, this is your expertise. So I don't think a 20 extra day is going to make, you know, it'll make a big difference, but not in our budget.
Joe, are you, how do you feel about a 90 to 120 day range?
Oh, I'm perfect. Absolutely.
Dorothy?
I'm good with that too.
Okay.
And so the way I would intend to write this, at least initially for your consideration, not to dictate any terms or anything to you, but this would be on unrestricted balances. So for example, those dollars that you have to hold based on your debt covenants that says that, you know, you have to hold these dollars, you know, those would not contribute toward this calculation. It would be unrestricted cash and liquid investments.
Makes sense to me, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm in agreement.
Okay. Well, I think that that answers that touched on all of the we did at one point or another touch on all the items that I was going to bring up with you guys. I know some of them we talked a lot more about than others. But Joe, if you're okay with this, I'm going to suggest that I just you know, outline what I think I heard from this group. And so you guys can kind of internally, you know, discuss it and think about it, and then, you know, maybe you can follow back up with me after you guys consider what I put together, and you may read it and say, you know, we've thought about it and we want this to look different, or you didn't capture this the way, you know, that we were thinking about it, and we can certainly make adjustments at that point. But then you guys would have something to contemplate for future action.
I think that sounds great, Grant. And I will tell you that this Zoom meeting is being recorded, right? And so we can provide you with that recording in case you wanted to go back and listen to some part of the discussion, you know, as to help you formulate your work product.
That's perfect to know. I would love to have that. That would be very helpful.
Okay.
Well, and I also think since Rich wasn't here tonight, that we can get him the recording, and that way he can kind of hear the discussion so that he can weigh in on it when there's a time to act on it.
And
No,
George,
I think that's a good idea, Dorothy.
yeah.
Oh, and George too.
George, yeah, similarly wanted something as well. So, well, Grant, this has been great. I appreciate your working through this with us, and I think will be beneficial to us to look at as guideposts, and for future boards to you know, get their head around in terms of what we do or try to do on a you know, from one year to the next, one board to the next, in terms of managing the finances of the corporation.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the feedback and the discussion. It was beneficial to understanding what you guys are thinking. So thank you for that.
Good.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Grant.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Joe, for putting this all together.
Yeah, and driving it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so let's, I think we can conclude with that portion of the meeting, unless there's any other thoughts on that. I'll go ahead and conclude that. And we'll move on to item number 6, which, I'm sorry, Dorothy. Item 6, which is agenda items, new business and discussion, possible action on agenda for next meeting. And 7, meeting date, set date, time, and location of next meeting. I've kind of moved forward on these 2 items for this week with a meeting on Thursday. Dorothy posted a notice earlier today, and I put some postings up around the plant and the pavilion. On Thursday, I'd like to have a meeting that will be focused mostly around the manager's report, and then also a legal update from our attorneys. Jose de la Fuente sent a note to Mike and myself earlier today saying that he'd like to talk with us. And I said, well, we haven't had a board meeting discussion with the attorneys since August, and I thought it would be good to do that on Thursday. So that will be for this week. Agendas went out, but I think we should wait until Thursday to set a next meeting date, to see what comes out of the Thursday meeting. So I just wanted to say that, but of course you all, if y'all have other ideas about meeting your needs for information.
I'm in agreement with you, Joe.
Good for me.
Yeah, that works as well.
Okay. Well, with that said, I will, we will hear.
Oh,
We will be
Nah,
together
we
with
lost
everybody
you.
Thursday.
we lost you for a minute.
Okay, I just said we'll be together again on Thursday, and I will entertain a motion for adjournment.
I'll make a motion to
I
adjourn.
make the motion. I second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
See y'all Thursday.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Bye.
Bye, Mike. Bye, everybody.
Bye.